Hi everyone, it's Emma Watson from Light Life Living, and today I want to share with you my weight loss story and give you some tips on what to work on, what worked for me, and to give you some of the background about why I developed this program with Sue Hughes and why I'm so interested in working on this topic of emotional eating and addressing the real reasons behind weight gain and then ultimately losing that weight and keeping it off. So I do have some notes. So I wrote up my story a few years ago now, and I've updated it a couple of times. So I want to refer to that because we're talking a few years ago now. So the story starts really when I was about 12 or 13 years old. That's when I started to put on weight and to use food in a dysfunctional way. Prior to that, I had been a normal child of a normal weight, maybe at times slightly underweight, but not extremely so. Around 12 or 13, I had some changes in my life. We moved countries, and I think just going into those teenage years, I really developed a very, very unhealthy relationship with food and with weight gain and weight loss and dieting. I went on my first diet at around that age. Started weighing myself. All those dysfunctional sort of habits started to germinate and grow around that time in my life. And that took me all the way through my teenage years, all the way into my early 20s. And around about age, I would have been about, 27, somewhere around there. I had had enough. I had done by this stage half my life dieting. You know, everything from soup diets to Weight Watchers to diets I made up on my own, to really restricting my eating and losing a lot of weight, but I could never keep it off. I would get to a good weight and then something would happen. It would all pile back on, plus some. And in around 2003, a colleague introduced me to this thing called tapping. And I'm a psychologist, and I was working as a psychologist at the time, but I had been trained very conventionally. And when I first saw tapping, I thought it was really crazy. And I thought, well, how can that possibly work? Like, come on, like that just isn't going to work. But the very kind colleague gave me the manual on it, which in those days, the EFT manual by Gary Craig, early version of that. And I played around with it a little bit. Fast forward a couple of years to February 2005, and my weight had continued to increase. By this stage, I must have been in the 80s, so I'm talking kilograms, so around in the early 80s. And I was horrified to reach 80, horrified and mortified to reach 80. So to give you an idea of my height and weight, I currently sit around 60 now. So, and that's a normal BMI. That's almost slap bang in the middle of a healthy BMI for me. So I'd gone over 80, and I actually stopped weighing myself at that point because it freaked me out so much. And I was weighing myself daily when I was really caught up in this. So in my late 20s. So for me to stop weighing myself, that actually was a big deal. I actually don't know what my highest weight was. I suspect it got close to 85, I suspect. But I remember getting to 82 and being mortified, and I know I put on more weight from there. So anyway, in February 2005, I'd had enough. I had just reached the point where I had tried everything in the books, the latest fad diets, and I was just getting bigger and bigger, and just a overwhelming sense of self-hatred, despair. Here I was thinking, okay, I'm like this in my 20s. What am I going to be like, by 40, by 50? What's going to be happening to me? How big am I going to get? I was incredibly desperate, and I thought, well, what if I try this tapping thing? What if I really give it a go and really try and address my weight issues with this tapping thing that I've had a little bit of success tapping on minor issues with over that couple of years between when I first saw it and when I started using it for my weight loss. So I also, some synchronicity, some timing worked well for me, because I received an email, and it was advertising an ebook. It was by the doctors Luke Carrington and Radomski, and it was just some information, a book they put together about how you can use tapping for food issues, for weight issues, and it gave me some ideas. There was also some information in what was then called EFT, Still is called EFT, but that refers to a very specific type of tapping now. And I'd signed up for those newsletters, and then occasionally there was little things about weight on there, and I kept those and used those as inspiration. So at this point, I have to tell you, I didn't think it was going to work. I honestly did not think it was going to work for me, but I thought I'll just give it a shot because I am desperate. So what I did is I got some sheets of A4 paper and I wrote down some of the things that I thought I might need to tap on, some of the things that might be triggering me, some of the emotional things I knew I needed to address. And I tried to be really thorough in that. I thought, well, I'm going to put in things that perhaps aren't true. Perhaps I don't know if I'm feeling this. I don't know if this is my trigger. And so I just tried to be incredibly thorough in my approach. And I think that was one of my keys to success. And I'll explain that more a little bit as we go. So I started with certain foods that I felt out of control with. And I actually meant to bring them to show you on this video and I forgot. In this part of Australia, and I don't know if it's nationwide, I suspect it is, and I suspect other countries have their own version of this, but in Western Australia, you can buy these from a certain supermarket chain. You can buy these bread rolls. They're sort of like that big, I guess, and they come in a packet of normally 6 or 8. And they've got their white flour and they've got like bits of bacon already cooked into them with cheese. Did I have a thing for those? Another one I can remember was, used to be able to buy them, and I don't think these exist anymore. They were in a red box. I think they were by Nestle, I'm not 100% sure. They were chocolate covered, Australians say almonds, English people say almonds. And as an English Australian, I interchange between those two pronunciations. But I remember tapping on those two foods amongst other things. And I remember this one time, and I was still getting familiar with the tapping points. And I remember I'd gotten a diagram from somewhere and it was on my fridge. And I'd had, I don't know, a terrible day at work and something had happened and I was stressed. And I'd bought a packet of these bread rolls, right? So here I am hoeing into them, thinking, I should be tapping. So I'm like kind of munching and stuffing food in with one hand and tapping with the other. And the most amazing thing happened because I don't remember exactly if I stopped on that bread roll, but I remember I didn't finish the packet, and I certainly remember I ate a lot less than I would have in other circumstances. So that did something, and that stuck in my mind. So initially, I wrote down some of the foods and made sure that I tapped on them, sometimes with the actual food in front of me and sometimes just thinking about the food. So I also addressed some general self-hatred and hatred of my body that I had going on. And looking back, my gosh, that was huge for me. That was devastatingly massive for me. There were acres of that. I can't even tell you the units to measure that in. I had so much of that going on, from programming and conditioning, from stuff I probably, did to myself. It was just so confronting. And you have to remember at that time I was using what we would now kind of call standard EFT, which has a phrase, like it has a more complete phrase or a longer phrase than how I might tap now. Here we are in 2018. So back then I would say something like, even though I hate my body, I completely and deeply accept myself. And I remember that add on that, I completely, deeply and accept myself, on the end of that being such a different thought process for me. I had never even entertained the concept that I could accept myself or love myself, and I certainly had no idea how to do it. That was life-changing for me, and addressing the self-hatred was life-changing for me too. So since then, I've learned about the simple energy techniques that were developed by Steve Wells and David Lake, where we use simpler phrases. The tapping is simpler, and that is the type of tapping that I use with myself now, and I also practice professionally now too. So that's one of the things I address. So really we've covered two. We've covered the food specifically and the general self-hatred and hatred of my body. The next thing was this resistance I had to being thin. Now, doesn't that sound strange? Here I was doing all these diets, going to gyms, writing up these schedules for myself, these, food diaries and plans and all this, starting every school term with I'm going to lose 10 kilos in 10 weeks. But I did. I had resistance to being thin. I'd lost weight, but then I'd always regained it and more. And I believed that my body was working against me. I believed that I had a set point that was too high that I couldn't budge from. And tapping on that issue really, really helped me. Because I was convinced my body was fighting to keep me heavy. So that was a really important thing to tap on. The next thing, I had a lot of guilt and shame, and it's worth looking into the difference between guilt and shame, because for years I used those terms almost interchangeably and I didn't understand the subtle difference between them. Now my understanding is that guilt is when we feel bad about doing something. So I could feel guilty that I scratched my car or misjudged a social situation or something like that and regretted something I said. Shame is far worse. Shame is feeling like a bad person because of that action, or actually just in general. So I had guilt, but definitely I had shame. Definitely I felt like a bad person, a worthless person, a broken person. I remember very much feeling that and very much relating that. Scales were a massive trigger and I was weighing myself daily. So were clothing sizes, by the way. They were a massive trigger for me as well. So that was something for me to work on. I stopped weighing myself. And that was such a wonderful thing for me to let go of, because that was not a good way to start my day. I was getting back into that rhythm of self-hatred, of getting fixated on numbers every single day. It wasn't healthy. So really encourage, if that's at all an issue for you to work on that too. All right, next thing, my metabolism and any physical issues I believed were hindering my weight loss. So at the time, in my desperate search for anything that could help me, I'd read some books and I'd come across this, at what was at that time a fairly new syndrome called polycystic ovarian syndrome. And off I went to see my doctor. They couldn't find any evidence of that except in some blood work, but there were actually no cysts on my ovaries. But as part of that, you have some hormonal imbalance, you gain weight, other lovely side effects like being excessively hairy. Like, come on, like as if we don't have enough to deal with. So weight gain was making that condition worse, but was also a side effect of the condition. So it was like this snowballing effect where I felt like my body was working against me on another level. So I actually tapped on that diagnosis, on that issue, and on my metabolism in general. I absolutely believed my metabolism was slow and it was working against me. I worked on that emotionally too. And something changed there. It's interesting how that all works. Okay, next thing. I tapped on all my failed attempts to lose weight, and believe me, there were many, many. So picking even the key ones, the ones you feel the most disappointed about, the ones that resonate the deepest, the ones where the most weight was lost, but then it all regained even more quickly than usual. So failed attempts to lose weight, and the anger and resentment towards yourself for not maintaining that weight loss is another area that just is well worth dealing with and certainly paid dividends for me. Okay, the next one is a key one. The emotional reasons why I ate. Okay, so if you could go in a time machine right now and rewind back to, the early 2000s and find that me back then, and you said to her, Emma, you're carrying this extra weight, how much of this is emotional? I would have said, look, I think it's some, but that doesn't explain it. I'm lazy, I'm unmotivated, I can't stick to things. From my 2018 perspective, all of that weight was emotional. All of it. I was using food to run from uncomfortable feelings, and I was so good at doing it that I wouldn't even feel the uncomfortable feeling. It wouldn't even come up consciously. It'd, start to bubble unconsciously, and then there I was at the pantry or the fridge. My perspective now is a lot kinder and makes a lot more sense. Back then, I just thought I was lazy and unmotivated, and I can see how unfair that was to me. It was that I actually had a type of addiction, a mild addiction, but a type of addiction. I was running away from feeling certain feelings, and I was using food to soothe those feelings, to push them down. So that was a key one. And I think I actually remember breaking down all the different emotions that I thought I was running from, things like stress, feeling guilty, feeling not good enough. Basically all the negative emotions, I just didn't want to feel them. So I would use food to stuff them down. Next one, again, this was huge for me. Fear of not losing weight and living my life overweight. I was worried that I was just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, because here I was in my 20s, having been miserable about this issue in my teens, and the numbers were getting higher, not lower. They weren't even maintaining by this point. So that was a really good one to work on. And in retrospect, I think that was actually, again, one of my biggest fears was that. And two, at that time, I had just started seeing the boyfriend who is now my husband, but, I had been single, in and out of relationships. I was worried I wasn't going to meet anyone, and carrying more weight makes it tricky in the dating world, yeah? Probably shouldn't be that way, but can be that way. The belief I would never lose weight and keep it off successfully. So again, I think that's probably a sub point from the one I've just raised. So I worked on my massive doubts that I wouldn't be able to maintain weight in the future. And great, because here I am in 2018, and this isn't an issue in my life anymore. Last one, my general feelings of not being enough. I tapped on issues associated with weight and food, and I realized there were other areas in my life where I didn't feel good enough. So as soon as I started working on the weight stuff and really addressing it, I realized there were other ways I was making myself feel bad. There were other things in my life that I was being unfair to myself about, that I was trying to be perfect about, that I was trying to maintain standards that were unrealistic. Things like keeping my house clean. Like the perfectionistic standard I was setting in retrospect. But it took some work to shift that, and it was well worth doing. So, look at my finger here. I attributed my long-term success to several key points. So, one of the key things for me was that I was desperate. So, and when I say that, I don't think there's a word strong enough to describe to you how desperate I was. Whatever that word is, that's the point I was at. That is the point I was at. The second thing is I tapped very thoroughly. I wasn't just working on, one little key component of this. I tapped on everything I could. And I didn't try and tap on my weight loss and, fear of reverse parking or, snake phobia. I tried to keep it pretty much to mostly on the weight. And because I had a list I was working from, I could go back to it again and again. And I actually did that. I actually was working in a job at the time where I had a mid-morning break and a lunchtime break, but I couldn't leave the environment I was in. And sometimes I would get those breaks uninterrupted. So I would sit there and use that time alone, obviously, because I wasn't going to be tapping in front of other people at that stage in my life. Now I'm much more comfortable with that. So it became my priority, and I really worked on that. I wasn't getting too distracted, although there were some other issues that came up and they needed to be addressed too. Now, I didn't tap on this issue every day. In retrospect, I probably would now, but because I didn't think it was going to work, but I wanted to give it a good go, I just did it a few times a week. Now, I think that's good to know, because perhaps you don't have time to tap daily, you're genuinely busy and there just isn't time to sit down every single day, so you don't need to. Next thing, I addressed all aspects of the problem, even ones I didn't think I had. This is a key one, because we can fool ourselves. We can say, I don't have any issues with rejection. I don't have any issues with guilt. But we do. And just saying that doesn't make it true. It just means we're in a kind of denial. And I knew myself enough back then to go, well, I might be right about that, or I might be wrong. So let's play on the conservative side and tap as if I'm wrong and address that anyway. And I'm so glad that I did that. So I tapped on everything I knew could be impacting on me, and issues other people had had. Even if I thought they didn't apply to me, I did it anyway. And the next thing was I kept a written record of what I was tapping on, and I used a rating scale. I just rated it 1 to 10. So for example, let's say one of the things on the list were, I can't stop eating those bread rolls I just told you about. That one was 10 out of 10 at one stage. And working on that, I made a note of that and the date, this is, 10 out of 10 true for me. And then a few weeks later, I checked in and I was like, okay, how true is it now? All right, 7 out of 10. I just wrote that down and the date next to it. Kept working on it. Okay, eventually that went down to 1 or 0, and it's no longer a part of my life. It's not something I think about. So just to finish off, here we are in 2018, which is 13 years later. That time has flown, I can tell you that. And I now have a sort of new set point for my weight, which is in the low 60s, around 60 kilograms, around there. It's actually hard for my body to stray from that these days. And I wrote in this last update that my doctor actually commented this to me the last time I was in his room, because he weighs, he does your blood pressure and weight every time you walk in. And basically said to me, how do you always stay at the same weight when everyone else in society is getting fatter? I didn't think it was probably the time to tell my very conservative GP about this crazy and amazing tapping thing. I can't remember what I said. I think I just said I worked on it or something like that. So it really was a huge identity shift for me, and a really important change in my life. Because of the benefits that I've had all these years since and been able to maintain really easily, but also it showed me how powerful tapping is and made me really passionate about tapping in general, but particularly tapping for weight issues, emotional eating issues. And it's what I do here in my practice, and it's what this program's about. So I know Sue's going to get on here and share her story at some stage too. So I'm sure she'll have some great insights for you as well. So please take anything that's been helpful. Please reach out and contact us if we can be of any assistance. There will be an email address in the bio in the box below, and also a website eventually that's just being set up at the moment. So if you're interested in the program we're developing, which will launch next year in 2019, or some individual work, or just have some questions, please reach out. All right, hope you enjoyed that. You take care, and I'll see you next time.